And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a pox fell upon the land, a plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. The maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw, and said, "This is not good." And so it was, he brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same."
Welcome to the Poor Man's Retro Game Room, and today I'm going to cover 5 very important or 5 must-play Sega Genesis games. These are 5 games that I love, that are masterpieces, that I believe any Sega Genesis owner should have in their library. If you miss these for any reason, or you're just getting into the Sega Genesis, man, check these games out because you will not be disappointed. Alright, so we're going to get started with an RPG. And back in the day, you used to hear a lot about, the Sega Genesis. They only have arcade ports. They don't have enough RPGs. And they didn't have a lot of RPGs back in the day, but the RPGs that they did have were great. And this one is a masterpiece, and that is Phantasy Star 4. So let's take a quick look at Phantasy Star 4. Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, was released in Japan in 1993, and then in Europe and North America in 1995. I can't tell you probably a whole lot about the Phantasy Star series that you don't know. All I can tell you is what I experienced playing this game. The reason that I love this game so much is that it's set in kind of a sci-fi era in the future, but yet it keeps all the same JRPG tropes that are in other role-playing games. But for some reason, the science fiction era and that setting and the environment and the story of this game just keep me engaged. I love the combat, and of course, instead of like spell points, you'll have TPs, which is like your technique points for the non-Android players anyway. You have to have that mix, that good mix of your party, and it's just really an incredible game. And if you haven't played Phantasy Star 4, man, find a way to play this game because it is that good. In my opinion, it's the best of the original Phantasy Star series. And what was kind of funny, as I remember back in the day, it wasn't really. It kind of received mixed results or reviews, and that's ridiculous to look back on it now because it's considered a all-time classic on the Sega Genesis. And once you play it and get into it, maybe get in 3 or 4 hours into it, you'll start realizing why, and you'll have a really hard time putting this one down. So this is a very, very important game to the Sega Genesis. If you have a Sega Genesis, of course, I recommend Phantasy Star 4. And this is one of those games, all the games on this list, man, play them any way you can. The second game we're going to check out is an early Sega Genesis game, and I remember having it early on. I had the launch model Sega Genesis Model 1, came with Altered Beast. There was no Sonic the Hedgehog at that point. So any of the good games that I could find for my Sega Genesis, man, I ate them up. And this was one of the early ones and one of the excellent games, and it really showed you what a great job the Sega Genesis could do with an arcade port, and that is Strider. This was one of the best ways to play it back in the day. So let's take a quick look at Strider. Man, once you hear that laugh, it's all over, man. First time I plugged this game in and heard that, after playing it, you know, I played it at the arcade, of course, and yeah, that just blew me away. And then once the game started, you just see how good of a port this is from the original coin-op arcade game. Man, it's awesome. And this was one of those games early on in the Sega Genesis library that you could kind of point to and say, man, that's why I own a Sega Genesis right there. Big pixels, great frame rate, everything just came together in this game as an early arcade port that made this game special. This is one of those games that I recommend every Sega Genesis owner to have. If you've missed this one, man, pick it up. There's something about this port, and a lot of it might be nostalgia, but I just think that it was a really great arcade port at in the early life of the Sega Genesis, and in my opinion, kind of a killer app, you know, real early in the Sega Genesis library. So yeah, Strider on the Sega Genesis. Play it any way you can. So the next game we're going to take a look at, it's a turn-based strategy RPG, and that is Shining Force 2. You can't go wrong with Shining Force 1 or Shining Force 2. I would say that 2 is probably the better game. I have a lot of nostalgia for 1, but 2 is an excellent game. Either one of those games, you have to have at least one of those 2 in your library if you're a Sega Genesis owner. It really did make owning a Sega Genesis worth it. It added value to your Sega Genesis because this was the only place that you could play these 2 games was on the Sega Genesis. So let's take a quick look at Shining Force 2. There's few series on the Sega Genesis that has captured my attention like the Shining Force series. There's just something about it, man. It's so good, and playing it, you know, back in the day was pretty awesome. I never really had played, you know, a strategy RPG, tactical RPG like this before. So, you know, this was my first experience with one, and there is a lot of nostalgia to it, but that's not all there is. This is a great game. It's very well polished. Just the way that it handles everything, you know, and there's strategy there, how you're going to form, where you're going to move, who you're going to put at the beginning, you know, the front of your line. You want those meat shields to be up front, and then your casters in the back. You want your casters and your healers to be able to access players, party members that they need to heal. There's a lot that goes into it, and when you first play it, you know, it really takes you along slowly and gets you there, and it really has just a perfect pace, in my opinion, on kind of teaching you the game, teaching you strategies, and teaching you how to play a strategy RPG. This game is amazing. Every time I pick it up and start playing it, I have a hard time putting it down. Man, I cannot recommend the Shining Force Series 1 and 2 enough on the Sega Genesis. If you haven't played this, man, remedy that. Find a way to play it. Play it any way you can. It's on several of the compilations, and that's not a bad way to play it because you can, you know, you can save at any time. Of course, there's a save battery on both the Shining Force 1 and 2, but Playing it on the compilations isn't a bad way to do it, and the price is starting to kind of skyrocket on the Shining Force games, so if that's the way to play it, man, hey, that's not a bad way to play it. But play Shining Force 2, you will not be disappointed. And the next game I would also consider a masterpiece, and I kind of passed it by early on. When I finally got this game and played it, it blew my socks off, man. It's awesome. Great graphics, great story, great music, sound effects, gameplay, everything is there. And that is, of course, Shinobi 3. What an amazing game, and a very, very good reason to own a Sega Genesis. So let's take a look at Shinobi 3. Shinobi 3 Return of the Ninja Master has to be one of the most impressive 16-bit games of all time, in my opinion. I mean, it's that good. And it's not just the graphics, it's not just the score, the soundtrack, the music, the sound effects. It's everything comes together. The gameplay is just flawless, in my opinion. It's amazing, and of course it follows most of the tropes of the Shinobi games. But man, it's kind of like this. I don't know, this one seems to be the most polished one of the first three. Now, I love Shadow Dancer, and I love the original Shinobi as well, and the arcade version of Shinobi, of course, but Shinobi 3 just seems to have it's kind of the pinnacle of the series. The parallax scrolling, the music, the boss fights, the enemies, just the entire atmosphere, the different environments that you play in. It is more accessible, in my opinion. It's not quite as hard, especially as Shadow Dancer, or as the original Shinobi. So it is a little more accessible that way. You can change the difficulty, but man, this game is amazing, and it's just fun to play. The bosses are huge. It had a lot to live up to, and it absolutely nailed it. This game, if you own a Sega Genesis, again, I know, sound like a broken record, but man, this is one of those games you gotta own. And the cool thing is it's on a lot of the compilations. You can play it other ways if you don't have a Sega Genesis. So, that's a good thing as well. But play it in any way you can. This game is awesome. It's worth it 100%. The price is gone up, but if you have a Sega Genesis and have a chance to play this on original hardware, like on a CRT, I can't recommend it more. This game is awesome. So yeah, Shinobi 3 Return of the Ninja Master, very important game later in the life cycle of the Sega Genesis. So the last game we're going to take a look at is my favorite Sega Genesis game, and it was a very important game when it came out. And the reason is because you could play Castlevania on the NES. There was 3 installments on the NES. Of course, the third one, just amazing. The first one was great as well. And then Super Castlevania 4 on the SNES. I love that game. What a great game. But finally, the Sega Genesis owners got Castlevania Bloodlines. And man, Konami did not disappoint on this game. And the only place you could play this, or you could have played it back in the day, was on the Sega Genesis. Of course, it's included in the Konami Best of Castlevania series that you can get on your modern consoles, of course. But what a great game, and my favorite Sega Genesis game, Castlevania Bloodlines. Now let's take a look at it. If you're a fan of the Castlevania series and you have not played Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis, man, you are missing out. This game, of course, was released by Konami in 1994, pretty late, you know, in the later, I guess, in the Sega Genesis lifespan. You can get it on the Sega Genesis Classic, which surprised me when they included it. It is a pretty high-priced game at this point, so playing it on the Classic isn't a bad way to play it. Playing it on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection that Konami released in 2019 isn't a bad way to play it either, and that's on all the modern consoles, so no CRT needed. But this game is unique to the Sega Genesis. It was just incredible to play, because you know, I had looked forward to and wanted that Castlevania experience on the Sega Genesis. I loved Castlevania. I loved Castlevania 3, of course, on the NES, and you know, I know my sister had Castlevania 4, Super Castlevania 4, and I just loved that game. So when we finally got it on the Sega Genesis, it did not disappoint, man. It's kind of strange because this is such a Genesis game. You know, it's Castlevania, but the moment you fire it up and you start playing, you know it's a Sega Genesis that you're playing Castlevania on. The graphics, the sound, it just has that Sega Genesis attitude. Now, the very cool thing is, as well, is there's a lot of replayability. You can play as two different characters, of course, John Morris and Eric Lecard. And of course, Lecard has the spear and has different moves than had been in any Castlevania game up to this point. And if you notice that his spear is called the Alucard Spear, which is kind of cool in Castlevania lore. Can't recommend this game enough. You probably have heard about it. If you haven't played it, man, it lives up to the hype. It really does. Such an incredible game. Perfect strike between fun and challenging, in my opinion. It does get challenging, but it's nothing that you can't beat if you if you play it enough and put enough time into it. So my favorite game on the Sega Genesis, Castlevania Bloodlines. This was an extremely important game in the Sega Genesis library. Wow, if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. Thank you for clicking on the video, joining me today in the Poor Man's Retro Game Room, and talking with me about the Sega Genesis. So many good memories, one of my favorite systems to collect for, to play. I love the Sega Genesis, and I was, of course, a Genesis guy back in the day. Alright, so thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a great and safe rest of your day, and just remember, the Sega Genesis does what the Nintendon't.